Welcome back to Social Studies 20. We are looking at an assignment 1. And I'd like to begin by reminding you why we do assignment 1. As part of our educational system, we're trying to graduate students who can then become participating citizens in a free and democratic society where they'll be surrounded by a diversity, a plurality of sometimes contrasting opinions. What we'd like you to be able to do through the skill set that is unpacked through an A1 process is be able to uncover and understand other people's perspectives. We live in a society today where we often find ourselves at odds with others, and sometimes we're too quick to jump to respond before we actually understand someone else's ideology. We're not asking you to adopt all others' ideologies. In fact, that would be impossible. But what we're trying to do is to see if people can critically unpack someone else's ideology and analyze it and say, this is what you're saying, and this is how it connects to other things. Those are some of the skills that we can get from an A1. Really uncover someone's perspective and connect that perspective to a variety of themes and recurring discussions like the nature of mankind, the role of citizens, the role of government, the purpose of life. These are things we do through an A1. So we're going to be looking at the A1 process here today. We have a couple of documents that aid us with that. We have this document that is already 73 pages long and growing, and in that document there's a guide. So we might want to quickly look at the guide and say, what am I meant to do with an A1? So we're talking about the theme of the source, key details within the source, connecting the source to the theme of the course, look at the inspiration behind the source, find the perspective, see if it's alluding to any specific events, talk about proponents, opponents, the vision of society, significance of issue, problem solutions, where does this source fit in terms of a sequence of events, things like that. It's always good to go back, remind yourself about the assignment. And then we need this. We need something to ground ourselves into and say, you know what? This will be a set of sources that will allow us a chance to practice our skill set. So this is early on in Social 20. So we've done some A1s in 10, but not everybody has had the same experiences or comes into 20 as confident in the assignment, so we want to go back over it. So we're going to be looking at a set here connected to the French Revolution. With any quote, source 1 is a quote, it's always good to read it through one time and get the big picture. And then go back, highlight key terms, and then use those details to unpack the perspective and all of those other things we're looking for. Keeping in mind the theme of the course is nationalism, it should impact or connect to nationalism in some way. It should be celebrating nationalism or potentially challenging nationalism. The French Revolution will end disastrously because its abstract foundations, purportedly rational, ignore the complexities of human nature and society. Society depends on traditions that honor, not ignore, the great chain of being. We must maintain the values and practices of our ancestors who made sacrifices to ensure that we can enjoy our lives today. Not everyone has the ability to be self-governing. There are some among us who are more capable than others to make important decisions. Looking at the upheaval in Paris, we can see what happens when we deviate from our traditions and allow the mob a chance to rule. So we read through it one time, we kind of understand it's an allusion to the French Revolution. We get some key terms, maybe we highlight terms like end disastrously, right? So we can look at that. The French Revolution will end disastrously. There's a tone. The word disastrously is purposely used to present a tone for Burke, that there's a negative association with the French Revolution. We are meant to avoid disaster. So we can we can conclude that Edmund Burke is a opponent of the French Revolution. Now, if the French Revolution is an expression of nationalism, it's a manifestation of the nation of France, the nation of the French citizens wanting their independence from the old regime, then we can infer that Edmund Burke's not a fan of French nationalism, because it'll end in disaster. Now, from the vantage point of 2023, we can use evidence to further the perspective of the source. When Edmund Burke associates the French Revolution with disaster, and he says will end in disaster, meaning he said this at the time of the revolution, we can infer that we can add evidence to continue the logic in the source. The evidence that would continue the logic would be the bloodshed. That is one way to quantify disaster, is to measure it with the bloodshed that the revolution causes. The reign of terror, the use of the guillotine. So there will be thousands killed in Paris, some killed by counter-revolutionaries, including the White Terror, the Terror Blanche, but there's also foreign wars. In the end, hundreds of thousands of people will die because of the forces unleashed in 1789, because of nationalism in the French Revolution. Ultimately, when you consider the fact that the French Revolution inspires nationalism, and nationalism will inspire the World War I and II, then we're talking about tens of millions of people will be casualties because of the legacies of the French Revolution. So when Burke says it will end in disaster, we can use evidence to quantify what he was predicting to be right. Now, we could pause there with the end in disaster and say, wait a minute. Opponents of Burke might say that the disaster was purposeful. It was necessary. That the system had to be blown up. That France had to be recreated. That the old regime was obsolete, was stale, was unjust, was unnatural. Right? That the old regime, based upon social and political and economic inequality and a lack of liberty, and held back the fraternity of the French people, it was obsolete. It wasn't in line with natural rights, natural equality, and therefore it was necessary to have their anti-feudal revolution. And therefore, opponents of the source would argue that although what some may see as disaster may be seen as a means to an end, that the end was a goal that was so needed that the means were necessary and excusable in a Machiavellian way, right? That the ends justify the means. That because the end is the birth of the modern French nation state, then the means, revolution, even though it looks like disaster from Burke's perspective, the means were excusable. That you needed some terror, as Robespierre would say, to achieve the virtue that they wanted. So the French Revolution will end in disaster. We already pull out the word disaster. We talk about the significance of the use of the language. We talk about how opponents of the source would attack the assumptions that that the old regime could continue. And we continue reading this and taking some notes, because its abstract foundations, purportedly rational. So Burke is saying, you know what? I've been listening to you, Locke. I know that you say mankind is rational, and the idea of having a representative democracy is rational. But he's saying, you know what? Are people rational? And this is a theme of what Burke is ranting about. Are people rational? Later in his rant, he'll say that when we allow a mob a chance to rule, deviate from our traditions, we have upheaval. So Burke is using the upheaval in Paris, the lawlessness, the anarchy in the streets, the terror under the Committee of Public Safety. He's using all that bloodshed in Paris as his evidence to quantify the fact that maybe what's happening isn't rational. That Locke is one of the philosophers that may inspire a shift towards a democracy, a shift towards more liberty, the idea that the will of the people is the foundation of a legitimate government. But Burke is saying, are the people able to express their will? And should we follow the will of all people? Maybe some people's will isn't as clear. So he says that, some are more capable than others to lead. Right? Not everyone has the ability to be self-governing. That's an attack on the idea of self-determination of pain, right? Not everybody has the ability to be self-governing. Some need to be parented, right? This idea that some are more capable than others. Well, Edmund Burke, by saying some are more capable than others, he's echoing sentiments of elitism and paternalism. That is the essence of feudalism. The idea that the feudal lord is going to make decisions on your behalf because they have more insight than you do. And, history is with some evidence to support that. Not everyone has the same education at this time. Looking back to the first experiments with democracy, you look at experiments like in ancient Athens and the Greek city-states that embraced it. You think of people like Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, and you think of Aristotle, and you think of Aristotle's pupils like Alexander the Great of Macedonia. Alexander the Great of Macedonia had an education under Aristotle that the average Athenian person could not have. So even though in a democracy we might say that we should listen to the will of the people, are all people wise? Are all people knowledgeable? Are all people equally capable of making sound decisions? If we try to listen to everyone, will we miss the insight from some that actually might better understand the course of action that's needed in this moment, in this crisis, to help us evolve to a better place? That's what Burke is saying, that not everyone is capable of making important decisions, and history does have moments of supporting that claim. And he's not alone in that claim. Carlyle has the great man theory. We have a number of fascist authoritarians like Sorel and Schopenhauer and Gentile that would say that we need to submit to those that have stronger will or more ability. Plato himself talked about philosopher kings. Those that had more insight or ability should be those who lead us. So there is some elements, some nuances, some undertones of elitism in Burke as he's speaking against the mob mentality. And as he's speaking against the mob, he's speaking against the essence of a modern nation and nationalism. What binds us together shouldn't be equality. We're not equal. We're not equal. And any actions to try to force equality upon us are going to end in disaster and upheaval. We must maintain the values and practices of our ancestors who have made sacrifices. So Burke has this classic conservative ideology saying that there's a great chain of being of our ancestors, our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, all these generations who have made sacrifices to allow us to enjoy today. And if in today we betray their legacy by diverting from their values, then how dare us? That's an insult to their sacrifices. The lives they lived for us to live today, we should at least pause and reflect before we suddenly jump and change. Sudden radical change is not even inexcusable. It's immoral. It's a betrayal of those generations that ethnically have made us possible. That their history is a history of struggle. And for us to suddenly just jump away and say, let's kill the king, let's get rid of feudalism, Edmund Burke might be saying, can we think about it? Maybe let's pause for a second. Let's think about that. Maybe it's not the right thing to do. So words like sacrifices, right? Purposely used so that there's an emotional appeal to maintain the status quo and to question the logic of the French Revolution. There are some among us who are more capable to make these important decisions. Look at the upheaval in Paris. Now, interesting to note, as we may know, Burke himself was a member of a representative democracy. He's not an absolutist. He is not a feudalist in true heart and mind, but he is a conservative, slow to change, and he's looking at the radicalness of the French Revolution and saying, this is too much. Now we go to source 2. Read it through once. We see that it's Paine. We know it's going to be Paine's going to disagree, but we might find some common ground here as well. Practice of the divine right of kings is a sinful perversion and manipulation that does more to dishonor God than to honor him. Independence from that system is my happiness, and it is in the happiness of the French as well. The path of this happiness is through liberté, equality, and fraternity. One cannot be happy when one is limited by the authority of others. Having said that, my happiness should never justify the necessity to kill others. Sending another man to the guillotine is not going to provide me more happiness, more freedom. It's just going to take away his. There is some common discussion here. To what extent was the French Revolution necessary? To what extent was the French Revolution beneficial? To what extent should we unlock the power of the nation? And if so, in what image should a new nation be created? It's both of them are weighing feudalism, right? Both of them are discussing liberty and to what extent by nature are we capable of being free, or must we be controlled? So as we unpack Paine, we're also talking about its inspired by the French Revolution. There's allusions to, there's references to the old regime, the divine right of kings that gave legitimacy to the old regime, right, to feudalism. And it's interesting that Paine questions the divine right of kings, but not in a way that questions religion. It questions the perversion of religion by the feudal lords. He's upholding God. He's upholding him and saying we must honor God and we dishonor him by using Scripture to control others. That in order to be actually happy, they need to be independent of the authority of others. So in this, you can see a lot of the nuances, the arguments that Thomas Paine's American counterparts, right, his colleagues, would have used to justify their own revolution against the British. That it was the idea that they could not determine for themselves their policies, like who to trade to. The fact that the English were controlling the 13 colonies through mercantilism and not allowing the 13 colonies to trade with others like the French. That's what led to the rise of independence. We want to determine for ourselves, self-determination, our economic policies. So Paine is echoing his own ideas of self-determination in this. And in that, there's an awakening of American nationalism. But Paine isn't just American. He proclaims himself as a citizen of the world. But at the same time, there's limits to what means are justifiable to achieve the change that he wants. Looking at that last paragraph. Having said that, my happiness should never justify the necessity to kill others. So that's like, you know what you guys are doing with the guillotine? Yeah, don't do that. That's wrong. Radicalism's wrong. So he is a progressive, he's a liberal, but he's not a radical. He's not saying let's blow up the system through any means necessary. He's speaking against violence. Sending another man to the guillotine is not going to provide me more happiness, more freedom. So on that note, Burke and Paine agree that violence isn't a means to achieve the necessary ends. But they do deviate in terms of what kind of government, what kind of structure they're wishing to create or live under. Paine believes he has hope in the liberty of people. Burke is a little more cautious as to whether or not people can be allotted liberty, or who should be given liberty. Maybe Paine has a bigger audience that qualify for it. He's less of an elitist. In Paine's final sentence or two there, in his rant about the guillotine, although he wouldn't be quoting Mill is, of the 19th century, you can see some of the ideas of John Stuart Mill's harm principle, that the limit of my freedom is when my freedom has a negative impact on yours. So even though it wouldn't have been quoted, the harm principle, at this time of Paine talking about the French Revolution, we can see similarities and common ground with John Stuart Mill and the harm principle that, liberty should only be limited if it has a negative impact on someone else's liberty. Hence the guillotine reference. So looking at the two, we can see that there is a common conversation about the French Revolution and, to what extent is it unlocking something better. And, both of them are wrestling with what kind of society they want, what kind of political, economic, social system. Paine is in favor of change. Burke is not. Paine does put a limit to that change. Let's not be radical. Now let's look at the third option. In the third option, we have a lot to play with here, don't we? We have a cartoon, and in the cartoon we have three captions. Now it's unfortunate that we typically read left to right, because chronologically it really moves right to left. That on the right, this is the old regime, the third estate bearing the burden of the two other estates, the third estate doing all the work. This is meant to be that reordering of society, right? The restructuring, the moment of fraternity, this moment of early in the French Revolution where there's a national consciousness awakened, and then a restructuring that has the third estate. They're the ones in command. They're the ones in control. But when you look at it and think critically, there are some nuances to suggest that not everybody's happy with the new post-French Revolution France. So when we see here is that, he doesn't look that unhappy, right? These guys look happy. This is before the revolution. This is the restructuring. It's kind of like playing musical chairs. What's happening now? But now that the French Revolution, this is obviously not the time of Napoleon yet, because they didn't know how the revolution would end or when it would end. But this is like now that the Jacobins are in control, this is France, and we can see that the members of the first and second estate are no longer happy. This guy looks downright unhappy. He's got new burdens. He's the one doing the work now. And yes, the third estate's happy, but did the cartoonist draw this in a way to say that this is our goal? We have to consider who's the audience of the cartoon. In the French Revolution, the majority of the French were illiterate. How would they communicate to each other? Through visuals. So if they're communicating to each other through visuals, if this propaganda piece, because it's a propaganda piece, it's trying to promote an end to the revolution, this is the shape of civilization as I want it, government and citizens and roles and such, then we must ask ourselves the question, who's the audience? If the audience of this is the third estate, then they might look at this and say, bravo, this is how we want it. What is the third estate? Nothing in the beginning and everything in the end. This is classic third estate propaganda then. But from the perspective of the other two estates, they might look at this and say, this is why we must resist the revolution. If this is the end that is in sight, then we must do something to avoid it, because it will not be fair to us. So, depending upon the audience, we may have different responses elicited. Members of the third state would look at this and celebrate it and say nationalism has unlocked a better nation, a nation that has provided freedom for the 97.5% that are the third estate. Whereas members of the first and second estate might look at this and say, wow, this is what nationalism has done. All it's done is created a burden for us. And if the third estate in the end is doing no work, is that sustainable for 97.5% of the population to live off of the wealth and the efforts of 2.5%? That's not going to be sustainable. So then, after we unpack the perspectives and the possible connections to the French Revolution and nationalism, the fourth paragraph would be a relationship paragraph, right? And in a relationship paragraph, typically we look at them now as a set and say, what do they have in common? Quite literally, we begin that paragraph with a sentence taken as a set. Each of the three sources offers some insight into the common question, comma, quotation marks. To what extent was the French Revolution beneficial? To what extent was the French Revolution necessary? Both of those questions are answered here. After you ask a question, to what extent was it beneficial? From the perspective of Burke, he would say this, that it wasn't beneficial because it created upheaval, it ended in disaster because the mob was irrational. Whereas Paine would suggest that the goal was enviable, that it was getting rid of a sinful relationship that was the divine right of kings, but it was the way they tried to achieve the goal, the radicalness, that was not honorable, that could not lead to happiness. And then, from the perspective of the cartoonist, we must consider the audience. Members of the third estate would say this. Members of the first and second estate would say that. After we do that kind of relationship, where we ask a hypothetical question and then answer it, We could do both. Was it necessary? Was it beneficial? Then we can look for common elements. So what do I mean by common elements? Whereas in source 1, where Burke talks about the upheaval in Paris, or in source 1 where Burke talks about disaster, in source 2, Paine refers to the guillotine. And they have this common conversation about the violent part of the French Revolution. And source 3 doesn't show the violence. They just show the consequences of the shuffling of political, social, economic power. Whereas in source 1, Burke talks about the complexities of human nature, referring to the fact that some are more equal than others. Source 2 suggests that maybe the divine right of kings, that kings have tried to use religion as a mask to justify this complexity, that maybe people aren't worth more than others. And in source 3, we have the reshuffling of power, but again, we seem to have inequality in the end. Source 1 talks about who should make decisions, and that some are more capable than others. In source 3, in the beginning, decisions were made by the first and second estate, and in source 2, it suggested that the legitimacy of that was from the divine right, but the legitimacy was a manipulation, a perversion of religion. These are called linear or actually like a tapestry relationship. This element links to this element, links to this element. That's another way to create relationships. So those are some thoughts that you can put together if you choose to do this set.